Context is our second session of our mandatory reporting series. We're running 5 sessions. This session is focused on governance. So I'm just going to skip a slide here 1 second. All right. What's going to be covered today? Today we're going to cover a bit on our research report that we're publishing next week, understanding governance. So on last session, we went about readiness assessments. It was a bit high level, kind of give you an idea what do you need to do, or a couple examples on how to answer certain questions to understand where you're lacking in terms of the disclosure. In this one, we're going down, right down to the governance pillar, which is the first of 4 pillars we're gonna do, and then a bit of Q&A. If any point you have questions, please do let us know. Also, if you can't see my screen for any reason, please let us know in the chat as well. All right. So like I was saying, once every 2 weeks, we're running this. These are the next dates if you're interested, or if you want to kind of block your calendar. But I definitely encourage you to go through this process and learn as much as you can for free, and with the context of us being able to interview so many people and learn from so many companies. Also, if you are a consultant, and Chess, I know you're there in the chat, I'm going to launch a poll to see if I can do this. Let's see if I can launch a poll here, polling quizzes. All right, I'm going to launch a quick poll, which is if you are a consultant or you are a reporting company. If you're on the consulting side, we are growing a partner program. Alex King is leading that. This is about collaboration with how can consultants, with technology enable, support these companies a bit more, right? It's about empowering, it's about, reducing cost to the end client, but also improving the experience of what they get by having a lot of shared learnings. Cool. So we have a bit of a 60-40 split between consultants and reporting companies. So really good to kind of share and collaborate in that sense. And thank you for everyone that responded. Really, really helpful. Awesome. All right. So as we continue, if you have any questions, just raise your hand. You've probably done this by now, a lot of Zooms, but feel free to react. Feel free to just jump in the chat and ask questions. The more you stop me, the better it is for everyone. Okay, starting with the first point, ASSP S2, or the climate financial reporting. We have done and about to publish a report with a lot of interviews and a lot of readiness assessments with 50+ companies. This is really the basis of why we're doing these presentations. Is we've gathered so much data and we're trying to surface that to our community in our audience. So feel free to kind of then get your hands on the research once we publish it next week. Key takeaways, regardless, is that most companies are still very underway with their mandatory reporting. Not many are ready to disclose, and even the ones, this is self-reported. We kind of surfaced a lot of key areas of concern, which can help you map as a consultant or as a reporting company where you should focus your energy if you're trying to really understand those bottlenecks. One thing as well is that most of them are engaging with a tool or a consultant. So if you're a reporting side, compare yourself to your peers and try to find budget. If you're on the consulting side, where can you add the most value without just, annoying the SG managers or the chief sustainability officers, and actually go in and deliver key insights for them.
I think as well, Fonz there,
yeah.
I think a big insight, and, this report's been amazing, the amounts of different companies that, Fonzo in particular has been able to speak to, but really just reinforcing, even though a lot of companies, as you can see, are using some form of software and using a consultant, ASIC is really recommending and reinforcing that boards should be upskilling themselves as well. And this is a key part of this. So, learning how to integrate climate into their enterprise risk assessments and thinking. So even if you are using the external source, it's still so important to be upskilling from a board level first.
And that's where we're kind of going to go in deep dive today. So a quick dumbing down of, or simplifying of language after reading many hours of sustainability and the legislation is saying that this new reporting, it's just imagining a new rule that has to be done. And of course, there are things that people have to do, and you can name them things to kind of really simplify it. And they have to be looked at in a short term, a medium term, and a long term. And these things that you have to look at impact your ability of a company to attract money, right? And who cares about this? These people who these reports are the primary users of this report. Now, this is board speak, and those users normally are related to investment, external investment into your company. That's the main purpose on why this is all happening, with the co-added benefit that if done correctly, you have a positive impact on the planet, or you are more resilient to climate change. But we call these things, climate risks and opportunities, but they are linked directly with finance. And that's why these new laws is to open up this information to investors to better allocate that money. This is all that it is. It's a lot of things, but as a simplified statement, these things is how it impacts a company to attract, borrow money, get investment, and so forth. You can add more primary users to your report in the way that you use your language, but that's the goal. All right. So this is what I'm trying not to show you, but this is what is behind the presentation. It's the dry legislation, the dry use of language that we then try to surface and simplify for our audience. The primary users of general purpose financial reports. It's a very long-winded. You just might call it the users, or who reads the report, or who needs it. The whole time frame of what things you have to look at and at which period, we just say for how long. And if you define how long that window is, you clarify that question. And then these things, they're broken down into, physical hazards from climate change, storms, hurricanes, bushfires, temperature increases, right? More nature related. And then you have the transitions, which is, if new law, how does it impact your business? If new technologies, how much do they cost? And so forth. So it's only kind of 6 elements that guide the whole reporting and legislation that you need to have at the back of your mind as a consultant or as a company trying to get board approvals, budget, and so forth. Lockie, do you just want to give a very quick rundown? Because at this time, our audience should be educated on this, but on who has to report?
Yes, sure thing. And yeah, assuming that most people here are very well across this by now, but as we know, our companies are broken down into 3 different groups. And as you can see here, group 1 is our first set of companies who are required to report. And that kicked off on the 1st of January this year. So $500 million of revenue or more, $1 billion or more of consolidated assets, and or over 500 employees. The only thing really worth pointing out here when we go down to the group 2 and group 3, because I know you can all read this slide and I don't need to run through all of the numbers, is that with group 3, there was an amendment made. And so now for group 3, we're looking at 50 million or more of revenue, and 25 million or more of consolidated assets, which is a change from the original 100 million, which is a big change. So there are going to be lots of you here who are group 3 companies, or even aspiring to be group 3 companies. Yeah, that's the only real change I would say if you're a consultant in the room, to just make sure that you're on top of, and the companies that you're speaking to who maybe wouldn't have originally been in group 3, but many more now are because of that slight change.
I'm just trying to move my presentation around so I can look you in the eye. So if you just hold a second. All right, let me see if I can do this. All right. For some reason, I can't get back to my presentation, team. I am locked out. 1 second. All right. Lockie, you have to entertain for a second.
That's all right. No worries. Well, Niall has been very helpful there with asking us questions. So that'll fill some of the time here. So Niall said, when do group 1 companies have to actually report? Is it on FY25 or FY26, being the first full year after it came in? So these group 1 companies are going to be required to report to to begin reporting in the financial year starting on or after 1st of July, which means that first reporting period will be publishing their climate-related disclosures released in late 2025. So it's a good question there, Noel. I know there's a lot of confusion and questions that come up about that quite a lot. But yeah, thank you for asking that question in that little
Right, we are back, Tim.
break.
Perfect. All right. So to clarify a couple things, is that there's two new standards that have been published. There's the voluntary and the mandatory one. And also it's important to understand that the S1 is about sustainability, broad sustainability in general, and the S2 is about climate-related things. You don't have to do both. And the S2 standard, what most people talk about today, the climate financial related disclosure, is just about climate, right? So if you are talking with your clients, your board, your internal users, and so forth, think about that you have to first decide if you're going to report on just the mandatory one or add elements of the voluntary standards based broader sustainability on this, right? So super clear that all this buzz and noise is actually about two standards, right? One is mandatory, the other one is voluntary. What do you have to report? Previously, people thought it was just about emissions measurements, carbon emissions, carbon dioxide, net zero targets, and so forth. Really core to understand. There are 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. Emissions only fall under the metrics and targets pillar. Everything else is related to other things that happen in your business. Today, we're going to cover that governance piece. Okay, so any questions on that, let me know, but hopefully it's clear that emissions is only a small part. It is core, it's very data driven, but there's other things you're going to have to communicate with your board, with your directors, and your CFO who signs on this. Also, not everything is made equal under the law. In this case, there are different assurance pathways. Third parties are going to check and audit your data. Okay, there's different timelines. An important thing to understand is that the governance pillar, strategy and risk and opportunities, and scope 1 and scope 2 emissions have to be audited and assured on the first year that you disclose. The other things, you still have to report on them. They just don't need assurance. Okay, so you still have to report all the elements of the standard. Just what you pay for to get assurance on that, and the evidence you have to keep in documentation varies between the different pillars. Any questions on that? Let me know. Awesome. But yeah,
we had the one question there from Niall, which is a great start to everyone not sitting silently and not asking questions. So please do follow Niall's lead and ask as many questions as you can if you'd like to.
All right. Now, what is governance in climate reporting? That's why we're here. You have to define the who, the what, and the how of how your leadership takes care of climate. As long as you keep these 3 questions in mind, you can then investigate the legislation a bit easier and how you communicate with these. But at a core, we need to know how people inside the organization are watching over climate-related things. And these people need to have a name, a role, the skills to do so. And that's what the legislator, in a sense, is trying to understand, but also what your users, your people that give you the finance, that give you the money, can trust the data that this company is being led by leaders who understand and have responsibility for climate-related things. That's the core of this good leadership. And now I've had the chance to actually map a bit of a common structure of, in larger enterprises, and of course in small organizations, group 3, group 2 companies, even in group 1, you might not have it already mapped out like this. And you might have other things like, investor committees and so forth. But this structure is where you can then segment part of the legislation, one being about the board and one being about the management, because they're talking to in different ways, okay? So governance structure, your board or committee that leads with climate risk and opportunities, the so-called things that I've mentioned before. And of course, the oversights, the roles and responsibilities, and the executive upskilling. The CSOs, the CFOs, do they actually have the support of getting upskilled in climate things. That's why it's very important to discuss on not just getting the job done of disclosing, but as part of that, you have to show evidence that the people that are dealing with these matters have spent the money or the time or passed the tests that showcase that they are actually knowledgeable and can, manage the day-to-day operations related to this. Thanks, Sharon, for the feedback. But yeah, just so you can start map. And now I'm going to divide the two things here in the different parts of the organizational structure as we go to the rest of the presentation. Hopefully, we don't take the whole hour, trying to make it short and sweet, but we still have the whole hour if needed. All right. Why it matters, the reason I bring this up is that building a strong governance structure, at least that's how we position it, sets the foundation and sets the business to thrive. Okay. There is more than just reporting requirements. And if you take the time to, bring your sustainability team that was isolated in the past under the CFO or reporting directly to the committee, bring the right people into, the risk committee and the sustainability committee, you in theory are setting yourself for success. And this just becomes business as usual. It's not just about the compliance, and you make better financial decisions because of that, right? This is climate related, but it's finance related. You'll make better decisions based on your investments, which markets you go after, how do you spend your capex, and so forth. The regulatory pressure is real, but there is an inherent nature on the governance aspect that if you do this correctly, everything else will follow. Any questions on that, on how we're separating, the different structures, let me know. If not, we're going to jump more into the particular questions inside the legislation. Lockie, you want to add anything on that?
I just had a question sent to me privately in the chat, which is a really good one. So, they've anonymously asked, does AASB S2 allow for shared responsibility across multiple committees, or is a single point of oversight required / preferred?
You can have shared responsibility for different topics across different committees. So your audit and risk committee does not have to deal with the same matters as your ESG committee, as an example. They can look at different topics. You might have, circularity if you were doing the sustainability S1 standard under the ESG committee, and then you might have your audit and risk. And now we're going to go into the people and remuneration and in the contracting side, and allocation of salaries and KPIs and so forth that might sit independently, completely separated from your SG committee when you're assigning those things.
Awesome. And this probably dovetails nicely into the next section, but there's another question. What's the best way to upskill a board without slowing down progress? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, and we go down deep dive into that slide, but there's an element of you only have so much time with your board, right? The important thing is when you do get the time to educate and upskill, that you're documenting the evidence, because that's need to be assured. So if you have meeting minutes, as an example, or you're distributing a pack to your board, 7 slides on topics that are relevant and material to your company, you need to keep evidence of that. It doesn't have to be a formal course. And you set your ambition level, you just need to demonstrate if that happens in a sense. Slowing down progress, of course.
Sorry, Fonz. One more.
Yeah.
In the Q&A box, can you clarify what is to be included in a climate-related governance structure?
So what needs to be included, it's not defined, right? And we'll go into like what you need to show, how you structure it. It's up to the company, because you might not be able to allocate all the committees or all the roles, depending on your size. It's just important to understand that you need to meet that criteria that we're going to deep dive in a second. So the structure is up to you. We can provide examples, but then you have to demonstrate how the different things are complied with within the different roles. But you have to assign someone, and I'll deep dive now into a second. All right.
Awesome.
I'm going to start with the board, right? And talking about the board in the committees. The key things to consider is that, board's role in climate risk. It's not just a nice to have and about slowing down progress, but it's now a necessity for risk management. We call it like business imperative because there's an element of it's now linked to your operations, finance, and in theory reputation, and it becomes a key business strategy and should have the same weight as other compliance needs and strategies that your company is going to implement. And then is that clear oversight. You need to be able to name names in a sense when it goes to reporting or which titles and roles have that responsibility. So back to question 1, and all of them are linked to a paragraph in the legislation, which I've labeled under the title, right? And of course, that who's in charge is a summary of context of that paragraph. You need to clearly name a specific board or committee or person that oversees these climate change matters. Okay, you have to name them. They need to have a role. They need to exist. It can't be into the future. It needs to be today. Who's gonna over the next financial year or calendar year reporting period to take charge of that. So, like I said, name the individual, the responsibility, how senior and influential, right? If you have to tell this to an external third party, to your investors, to your bank, private equity, whatever it might be, would they believe that this person is high enough in the company to have enough pull to get things done, right? That's where that's seniority and how influential they are comes about, okay? It can't just be naming someone that sits outside the structure of the organization, that doesn't have budget, that doesn't have pull, doesn't have buy-in. You need someone that they believe can lead the charge. So a committee composed of several people in there, several roles and titles, normally does the job because you have a bit more buy-in for the company to get things done. All right, that's the first question. Start by naming the who. All right. Now goes to the harder part where you actually go from just naming, which can be easy. You can just look at your org chart and start selecting people, to having to surface the job description and responsibilities of this individual. And you might actually have to modify them to make sure it hits the criteria, right? If someone is a marketing manager, it happens that we see a lot of like sustainability in marketing managers as an example. A lot of people like, finance and sustainability. That job description, if and separate a bit of like the public shiny report that you see from the companies and what you actually provide as evidence to your auditor. When you attach that role description, right, and skills necessary, you need to make sure that the part on climate is relevant enough that it passes the criteria. So if you have 7 bullet points on marketing and then 1 just on climate, that might not be enough to pass your audit and to be truthful to a sense. So clearly defined and integrated into existing governance documents, needs to be documented. Significant in that overall responsibility is climate change. And of course, the targets and expectations on the day-to-day of that role, they are linked to climate. So not just about naming that they're going to oversight climate targets, they're going to do this in these ways. All right? Really clear. Think about the job description, think about evidence to an auditor. It needs to have a Word document, it needs to have a role name, a role description, and so forth. When I say job description, you also, if you name a committee, it could be the role of that committee, but just think about that those things will need to be documented. Awesome. All right. We're going to move into the skills and the hard part where like some money now starts getting involved. If you already had the people, you didn't have to hire them. You need to know that these leaders or the people that have responsibility have the right knowledge and abilities to do so, right? So does the board or responsibility committee have the members with the climate science, the sustainability, or related field experience to be deemed capable to implement, lead, change, strategize things that are climate related? So if you have no background and you maybe only had like you've done 1 course online on carbon accounting, that might not be deemed enough. You need to show evidence that you either are cross-transferring with the soft skills, or you have the hard skills from previous jobs, right? Or internally, you have been ongoing leading sustainability practices and initiatives, and now you're being elevated to take charge of this. Okay, that's the biggest thing with this is people left it too late, and they might not have anyone internally in their companies that can take that step. And you're now forced, you see a lot of open roles, trying to bring people with sustainability managers experience on the companies, but then you asking them to not only provide strategy, but also operations, a bit of everything, and people are being stretched out, right? So planning in advance, if you're in that group 2 or group 3, how can you start upskilling your team internally, or looking at positions, or finding the budget to over time bringing those skills inside, or upskilling your own stuff. Makes sense, the part on skills?
Yep.
Cool.
Keep going.
I see some things popping up, notifications. I don't know what it is.
We've got a question. So for evidence of skills, does it matter to show what level of skills? And I think you answered that quite well.
Yeah.
But
So a good example is you see in a lot of public reports with other risk aspects of a business, where you might label things like starting proficient expert in a matrix, right, or in a table in a public report, right? You might do the same thing for climate, where you create your own categories. They don't have to be super in depth, but you give them parameters, and then you allocate, or when people in different committees or different board seats or hierarchies of your company are at in terms of that matrix and skills level. Claire, do I recommend any formal courses? I don't think formality comes into the equation, Claire. I think you need to know if they're good or bad. Looking at having a transparent curriculum in a sense. If you want to invest in things like Australian Institute of Directors courses, super expensive. They might take time, but your CFO might want to do that as an example, or other directors. But things like, if you're in an area of logistics, why don't you upskill in something that's related to the industry? So you kind of do two things at once. You upskill in climate, but also opportunities within the industry and how that sector is changing in terms of technology and new legislation. You can pick that upskilling. This does not involve doing a whole master's on this if you're just upskilling your staff, but see how much time you have, right? If you have 2 years, maybe you have an internal staff that actually wants to take that extra step in an education journey, and this is your chance to actually support them and show evidence that you have the skills in that committee. At board level, go ahead, Logie.
yeah, I just think following on to the point you made there and Claire's question, like I think the AICD's course is really fantastic, and yeah, the effort they made in putting that together with the CSIRO, as you rightfully mentioned it first, and I think it is the first one that comes to the list. So yeah, if you want to start somewhere, I'd look there.
A good example as well, NetNata has a couple of very high-level courses in our academy, right? And it provides you a deep understanding to then take a next step if you want to have any formal education, to a sense, a university or whatever it might be, to understand where you want to focus. Your carbon accounting, materiality, as an example, risk and strategy, and so forth. Awesome, great questions, team. And like I said,
we can take another question here, Fons, or do you want to wait until we get to
let me just finish this slide and I'll move on. Thanks for that, Lockie.
We've got a couple more questions that are rolling in.
One point, there is a plan to address the skill gaps, right? It doesn't have to be perfect from the get-go. You can show that people are in a, just knowledgeable stage of climate, and you want to move them to expert. Outline over the next 5 years or 3 years how you're going to allocate budget, or how you're going to segment part of your employees to go and learn about certain things. It's what the state of today and the plan to upskill into the future, right? Planning is part of showcasing the transparency. All right. So yeah,
I can there's a couple of questions, and I can maybe give you a short breather, Fons, so you can have a glass of water or something. So
yeah.
You're working overtime here. So there was another anonymous question that came through. So what is your understanding of the assurance requirements? It's a sign off by an audit firm with CPA right. So yes, companies must obtain limited assurance in the first stages, as Afonso sort of pointed out there a little bit earlier on in some of those slides where we had the sort of clip that had come from an Excel sheet. And this is from a CPA qualified auditor, so correct. So to that question, and then another question: how long do the organizations have to prepare to set up those expertise committees successfully, say group 2 companies?
I'm back, Tim.
He's back.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's a bit of
Yeah.
a how long's a piece of string, but let's say because it's a group 2 company, let's assume that you've got all of the time to properly prepare, and this is not something that you're rushing into doing. So preparing and setting up that expertise committee successfully, I would say, Fons, what do you think? Do you think about 2 months?
I think 2 months might be you mapping, your understanding of where everyone sits. It's gonna take you longer to have now find time in people calendars to meet every fortnight or every month on these topics, right? Someone to prepare agendas, someone to share, action points after those meetings, someone taking on that role. It will take a bit of time to get ingrained. What I suggest as a group to companies, if you do it now and you set that process now while you have time, that by the time you get to disclose, you can show actually the evidence of these meetings taking place. So maybe you don't have the enough skill compared to a group one company who has that budget, but you actually have the evidence that you've been ongoing some actions, some decisions, and some progress that showcase to that user, right? To the people who read the report, that this is ingrained into your business as usual. Right? That's how like the more time you have, the better. But think about small things like preparing agendas, finding the time, headspace to take on these tasks. But the first meetings of that committee, as an example, if you set up a committee, might be let's map our skill matrix and see where everyone is at, and then you can take the next choice of hiring or upskilling, etc.
Awesome.
Thanks for the question. All right. So brings exactly to that, recurring meetings. How are they staying in the loop? Okay. So again, paragraph link there if you want to deep dive into legislation. But we want to know these people, who they are, what they do, what they're responsible for, and how they stay in the loop of these matters. And then understand how they respond to certain things. Things like how frequently you meet, it cannot be ad hoc, it needs to have a cadence, right? Or if it doesn't have a cadence, it needs to have a trigger point. If something happens, then people are meeting. So it needs to have that process. What kind of information is provided? So when you go into these meetings or let's say just sending information up to the board or the executives or the CEO, what is being sent? Are you sending a pack? Are you sending an update on the risk matrix? Are you sending an update on the skills matrix? All these things need to be documented. So from the outside, you know exactly what information is flowing up and down the company. And then who provides it? If you're using an external consultant to do your materiality assessment and you're reviewing that every 2 years, right? Define that. At this point, we believe that we're going to use a consultant. We've done it once, and now we're going to do it every 2 years to review the materiality assessment. Or if it's triggered by an event, might be a change in your market segment, a new technology, a new opportunity, and if it's timely or relevant. Okay. If you're saying that you're only going to meet 6 months after materiality assessment is done, it might be considered too late because we want to invest in a company, if you're going to use investment language, that is proactive about these things and can prepare ahead of time. And things, people know that things take time. If you're going to do something that's relevant, you do a risk analysis, a risk assessment, materiality, and then you have to allocate budget. Budget cycles take long, finding the capital, how do you plan ahead? You're going to enter into a new market segment to capture the opportunity of sustainability in a certain product line. All these things take time, and we want to see evidence that everyone across the chain is getting their hands on this information, especially if they're responsible for making those decisions. It might be all the way from marketing team, segmenting how they react to a certain campaign around, climate and the potential of that market, following that to, the ESG committee that has to take a decision based on that.
Can I just add one thing here, Fons? And you definitely touched on it and alluded to it, but the importance, of course, of the structure around how you set this up, but also the importance of the reporting lines you set up to make sure that this information is getting to the board, is getting to those board committees, is getting to those stakeholders that you've set up that have that have this responsibility. The reporting lines is a really, really important part of this piece.
Awesome. All right, Tim, we're now officially halfway through our questions. There's only 8 questions in governance. let's jump through them before you go on holidays. Climate change and big decisions. Okay, we're still at that board level, remember? Still at that board committee level. How are they considering climate change, right? In the overall strategy, in making decisions like new deals, new investments, capex allocation, in setting up the management, who they hire based on the risk that they foresee into the future. And then trade-offs, documenting trade-offs. We cannot proceed with this action because XYZ related to climate. So we want to showcase how you explicitly taking those decisions. It might be a simple decision tree, right? A decision tree might be make a decision above X capex, right? Considering climate risks, you take that step, evident there is no climate risk that stops that decision, continue under the decision tree. Things like diagram evidence or step-by-step processes are sufficient in this if we have policies that then set up each of the steps even better. Things like, conflicts between setting a financial goal, right, and setting a climate goal. A good example is, imagine if you were, I give this example several times, you were hosting a multitude of resorts in the Blue Mountains here in Sydney, right? You have a very big window for high season where you do most of your bookings, and now you have to plan an expansion, and you're gonna believe that you're gonna increase, 15% year-on-year bookings. Now you have to make that projection and showcase that you've considered climate risks like fire hazards, bushfire season extension onto that same target. So is it realistic that you can do 15% year increase if you consider that once every 3 years that might be a bushfire that covers the region in smoke and people will stop booking or ask for a refund? That's the kind of decisions, in a very practical way, that your strategic leaders need to consider when you're doing projections or financial allocation and so forth. That's what the users want to see in the consideration phase. If you're in a different industry and you want me to try to make an example on the fly, feel free to pop in the chat, be it logistics, being work, construction, engineering firms, professional services, and so forth. All right. So the word here is integrated, risk integrated into decision making. That's the core of this paragraph. Finally, I think this is the last question on the board level. Okay, then we're going to move into management. This is there's an important thing in this question 6 or this paragraph 6A5, which is remuneration. We need to show evidence, and I say we are people in this room, of how compensation is linked to executives when it comes to climate, right? This is the classic. If you hit part of your, it could be linked to greenhouse gas emissions. If you reduce scope 2 by X or scope 3 by Y, therefore you get a bonus of sorts, right? So now that's why you have that remuneration committee when people have to sign off new contracts, right? Or new bonuses based on climate metrics. And that might be, being able to, going to every meeting, or might be things like, not even might be reduction. It could be a target of mapping your supply chain or learning more a particular area of your business that you could expand on. But you need to be able to link that and then also set the ambition for your science-based targets if you're going to set one. If you're going to set reduction 2030, 2050, your progress towards those, link that to remuneration and so forth. This is a challenging part because there's a very human nature to remuneration, but you need to be able to set that to showcase as evidence that people are taking this seriously. So very controversial to a sense, and while there's a lot of pushback in consultation on this, thinking like a board or a director now being impacted by climate in how much money they take home, but that's how the goal setting is happening.
So Fonz, just before we go to the next lot of questions, I guess a lot of content in the last 6 questions you've gone through there and in the last previous 6 slides. Saying it back to you in a bit of a way here, what we've covered there is the importance for really clear climate oversight and it being assigned to specific people. So that's, I think, the first point. The second thing was that it's really important for everything to be documented and for that governance to be really well documented and clearly mapped out. Then it's all about upskilling, making sure that our boards are competent and they know, what all of this is, and they have the skills in their tool belt to do this properly. Then I think you spoke a lot about sort of the integrated nature of this and how it brings in so many different departments. I know you had that org structure slide a little bit earlier on. So integration, making sure all of the different departments are connected. That of course pulls into all of your controls, your data systems, where all of this information is actually coming from. And then as you pointed out, very clearly on this last slide, setting those goals, watching those goals, making sure the reporting structures are there for those goals. And those lines of communication are really clear between everyone.
I think that's bang on, Loki. Thanks for the summary. In on the back of that, there was a question from David just now, giving an example of remuneration there, which is an example of an HR executive achieving a particular rate of uptake on new skills and relevant positions linked to climate, right? Could that be an evidence or a practical scenario? 100%. If you're setting the target after you meet with your board and make your plan that you need to bring on 2 extra people in these roles, or that people have to complete certain modules within the organization, that could be a very easy logical link in terms of remuneration. If that person, remember, if your HR executive now has a responsibility to deal with climate, right? So you have to edit that job description or that role, right? Sign that off and show that they also now responsible for that, and then link remuneration. Yeah, thank you so much, David, for the question. But yeah, bang on. And yeah, thanks, Loki. All right,
Fantastic.
now 2 questions to go with 15 minutes to go, which is fantastic. Thanks everyone for sticking through.
Do we want to give anyone an opportunity to ask questions on all of that? On that, I know you just skipped very quickly through a question slide, but does anyone we've had so many good questions from everyone. So if there's any others, please do throw them into the chat. I'm sure we'll see them coming through.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve.
Oh, there's one. Sorry, Fonz. What are some examples you see of integrating climate risk into existing financial and operational systems?
So like examples, you mean?
Yeah, or what are some ways that you can
a practical example, right, which is very logical. People talk about like what's called like sustainable procurement, right? This is a client-facing activity, but if you make the decision of mapping your, and we're going to touch on the next sessions, your risk and opportunities. But once you've done that, if you are altering your procurement policy to include things that match your criteria, you now see a whole department that is, allocating budget, doing purchasing, buyers, having to change the way they do work because a new policy has been documented, and now you have to report on the effectiveness of that policy back to, the rankings of the organization. A real simple thing. The example of David with HR, same thing. It's an evidence that now it's operationalized. The person has a new goal of doing day to day and searching for new candidates based on a decision that came out of like a change in governance when it comes to skill gaps. Right. So really clear, tangible things that you can imagine reading them or imagine sitting like in a folder inside your drive. That some people take ownership of and change the way they behave.
Awesome. One more question before you keep going, Fonz. And I know you're trying to make sure we finish on time for everyone's holiday sake, but question from Tony. How stringent of evidence for climate-related target setting, e.g. carbon reduction for short-term and mid-term, what is needed to submit a list of initiatives signed off by board in 5 years?
Perfect. Tony, I'd love you to join the sessions on target setting. When it comes to there's 2 things with the time frame. There's things about risk, transition opportunities, and so forth. How is your market changing? Things that you're exposed to, and you need to map out how you prepare for those. And then there's target setting, which might be related to like emissions as an example. Those need to have scientific evidence to a degree that they actually be achievable. If you're gonna say you're gonna have 0 scope 3 emissions, it's unrealistic because you might not be able to achieve that because of your industry. There's not enough electric fleets roll out for your logistics company in Australia. All right, so things like that. That's the evidence. You need to showcase that you've consulted or investigated or have a source that you can use as a backup for your decisions. And those sources could be, what are other peers in your industry doing, right? Other documents. If you go to, your competitors, how are they positioned in some of the market? If you look at like market leaders, if you're looking at similar industries that might have similar problems, how do you bring those across? And that evidence could be varied. You just need to provide how you come up to those decisions. But we'll deep dive, Tony, into the evidence on the next sessions.
I
Okay.
think adding to that, Tony, as well, like from everything Afonso said in the previous slides, it's really so much about having those board approved initiatives that are really clear, making sure that it's set up so that all of our outcomes are really measurable, and making sure that all of this is wrapped up and documented properly, and of course set to actual time allocations. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I think that sums it up quite well.
Thank you. But yeah, I'd love to cover that on the next sessions, Tony. All right, 10 minutes to go. Now we move into like executive management, your CSOs or whoever below that is being allocated things. The question opens up, what about managers? Managers operationalize a lot of these decisions by the committee. They have the boots on the ground. The way that we describe this is, how are people keeping an eye on these teams or these people, from the board level the way to operationalize, and things to consider that kind of can spark conversation within your organization is there a role that actually takes this operationalized responsibility, like a chief sustainability officer, could be a sustainability lead, could be sustainability manager. You can describe them. They don't have to have the management sustainability name in there. Could be, risk as an example, taking this responsibility. um, Within management, do you have another committee? Like, since you've been talking about board level, do you have a committee where like the managers are meeting together? These people are meeting together at certain cadences as well. Going from board to operationalize. Reporting lines, like Loki was touching on. How do they talk to each other? What is the channel? How frequently? And again, separate what you see in a public report, if you're a public company and you put it out, versus evidence, and how used for day-to-day operations. They don't have to have the same complexity, but you need to build the 3 paragraphs that you put out based on evidence that you have in a more extensive document. And remember, answering these requests can be done in an Excel spreadsheet. What I mean by that, you list all the paragraphs, you list all the responses and all the evidence. It doesn't have to be flashy to begin with. It just needs to exist, and then you can curate that to your users and make it available. How does management report to the board? How do they do that? Are they only be able to get 10 minutes or 15 minutes every quarter in a board meeting? Do they have a direct channel which they can email in share packs? All those little details that seem nuances are important to make this a realistic case, and they can be answered in a sentence and sign off as a policy, but you get the idea. Similar to if you ever done like ISO for security as an example, it's a lot of things to do. Some appear like no-brainers, like having passwords in your computer, right? But you need to show evidence that you're actually having a password on a computer. It goes to that level. Um, Last question, management tools and integrations. This is if there is controls in place, if you decided to put them in, how do those help oversee, right? So it might be a check with your teams, might be actually systems that surface data to your management to make decisions. Those controls and procedures define the boundaries on how this impacts the day-to-day operations. And this is what we want to see here at evidence. Do you have internal auditors that check the data before it goes to the board, as an example? A peer that, peer review your pack. Considerations, this is where we go into like business processes like supplier management, investment appraisal, and so forth. How are those things embedded? Is it actually used in operational decisions? Is your marketing team or is your buyers team making different decisions based on the information that they're seeing? And finally, how do they communicate across other departments? This is more about that, like we said, that day-to-day operations show us that it actually impacts how these managers go about their work and how they communicate with their teams. So
I
it was 8
think
questions that we covered.
I
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Fonz. I think on this, like the idea of integration of climate and sustainability into your business as usual, can be a challenging one for some businesses to think about because it's new. And I a couple of weeks ago, I heard a presentation from Transurban, and they gave a really good example of how they've incorporated internal carbon pricing into the infrastructure investment modeling for everything that they're doing, right? And that's just a fantastic way of looking at an integrated approach of bringing everything we've spoken about, bringing all of their carbon accounting into the models for everything that they do. And as you can see, that'll obviously flow across every department, which means everybody becomes naturally very aware of what that means for the business. So I think there are little examples like that are occurring all over the place with the leaders in this space.
Thanks. Awesome. Any questions on that, team? We have 5 minutes to go, and then I just want to quickly show you some of the tools that you can help and use. But any questions on the whole presentation?
We've got a couple more, Fon. So Ben has asked, will these questions be the same for companies in groups 2 and 3?
100%. All the same questions for everyone.
Fantastic. Awesome. And I think that's it.
Sorry, a nuance that there, how we then go into different pillars is that depending on if you're like in the financial institution and so forth, you might have allocated also another set of questions, right? But the main core structure of the standard is applicable to all group 1, 2, and 3. Of course, think about the rollout of assurance on the different pillars of your disclosures.
Great point.
Lastly, like I said, if you need help, we have a bunch of resources from completing the readiness survey, which maps on the 4 pillars where you might be lacking. We'll send it across, complete that, and that's what actually has been included in our research. But it's a valuable asset depending on how you can go to companies and go to your board. We have a couple of roadmaps, and of course, we have our core engine that helps you do compliance, which is our software. From carbon accounting to the project management of all these disclosures in kind of a task manager, supply engagement, and so forth. Awesome. All right, team. I think that's it. You are free to go. Please give us some feedback. Would love to continue the conversation. I'm going to email every single one with these resources, or Francesco will. Thank you for all the partners that joined and everyone in the consulting space. Happy to collaborate and tell you more about how we work for the companies. Please reach out with any questions. If you're group 2, group 3, there's time, but let's start the journey very early.
Awesome. Thanks, Fons. Great job. And thank you, everyone, for joining. It's fantastic to see lots of familiar faces in the chat. And yeah, as always, reach out if you need anything at all from us. We're here to help.